Today we will be talking and drawing really badly about a 2018 study from the Journal of Experimental Biology titled Comparative Feeding Strategies and Kinematics of Faucet Seals, Suction Without Specialized Skull Morphology.
The shift from terrestrial to aquatic habitats by marine mammals required morphological and physiological adaptations in feeding strategies because water is a more viscous barrier than air. Pinnipeds, seals, sea lions, walruses use all three of the following strategies. 1. Biting, in which prey are seized by jaws or teeth. This is used by terrestrial ancestors of pinnipeds. 2. Filter feeding, where specialized structures act as a strainer for small food and prey. And 3. Suction, where low pressure created in the mouth bring in prey. Many studies classify the majority of pinnipeds as biters based on skull morphology. However, only recent controlled feeding trials with captive pinnipeds show that species alter their feeding strategies contextually with varying extent. The species of seal examined in this study are bearded, the most ancestral phocine lineage, a suction feeding specialist; harbor, morphologically pierce and suction feeders; ringed, morphologically pierce feeders; and spotted, morphologically pierce feeders. By the way, pierce feeders use a combination of biting and suction to swallow whole prey. The objective of the study was to comparatively describe feeding strategies of the selected species through controlled feeding trials with whole prey. There were two hypotheses. First, bearded seals use primarily suction feeding and the other three seals use pierce feeding based on skull and dental morphology. Second, harbor, ringed, and spotted seals would be more similar with regard to feeding styles than bearded because of their evolutionarily close skull and dental morphology. Trials were held in the Long Marine Lab, UC Santa Cruz, SeaWorld San Diego, and Alaska Sea Life. They used 2 bearded, 3 harbor, 3 ringed, and 2 spotted seals. Feeding trials and kinematics were analyzed by using a PVC and metal clamp feeding apparatus in a pool. Prey were held 90 centimeters underwater and released right before the seal reached the clamp apparatus. Prey were whole or half capillin. The seal head was recorded and analyzed with GoPro Studio in QuickTime. Suction feeding was characterized as the seal forming a small hole with its mouth and prey quickly flowing into the mouth. Biting was characterized by a wide gape with curled back lips showing teeth on contact. The anatomical landmarks determined for kinematic quantification were 1. Rostral tip of upper jaw, 2. Rostral tip of lower jaw, 3. Caudal most point at corner of mouth, 4. Rostral most point of eye, and 5. Rostral border of hyoid. Variables included feeding event time, max gape, time to max gape angle, time to max gape angle, max gape angle opening velocity, time to max gape angle opening velocity, max gape angle closing velocity, time to max gape angle closing velocity, max galar depression, time to max galar depression, number of jaw motions.
994 feeding trials were done using the 4 types of seals. Overall, suction feeding was the primary feeding strategy used by the seals. Pierce feeding or biting was also seen, but not as often. The 2 exceptions to this trend were seen with 1 ringed seal that primarily used pierce feeding and with 1 harbor seal that only used suction feeding. The scientists were able to characterize the different modes of feeding. Seals that used suction feeding had similarities in their behaviors and anatomy. In general, the seals would create a small circular opening with their lips, followed by the tightening of their lateral facial muscles in order to depress the lower jaw. The change in pressure would bring the prey either fully or partially into the mouth in a quick, fluid motion. The lower jaw would then be brought up to capture the prey, and water would then be forced outside the sides of the mouth. Teeth was never visible during suction feeding. When seals used pierce feeding, a combination of biting and suction was necessary in order to bring the prey into their mouths, with one or the other occurring first. If suction was done first, the patterns mentioned with suction feeding remained the same. The prey was never fully brought into the mouth. At this point, the seal would bite down using its teeth and jaws, followed by alternating between biting and suction to bring the prey into the mouth. If biting was used first, the seals would use a forward motion to bring its jaw close to the prey. It would then draw back its lips to reveal its teeth, followed by biting down on its prey. All seals exhibited forward flexing of the vibrissae as they approached the prey, making contact with the prey prior to either suction or biting. The orientation of the prey did not change the way in which the spotted seals approached the prey. The other three species of seals manipulated this orientation of their prey before entry into the mouth.
Suction feeding was associated with shorter feeding times, shorter time to initial jaw closure, shorter time to maximum gular depression, smaller maximum gape angles, smaller maximum gular depression, and a reduced number of jaw motions. Pierce feeding was associated with all the opposites of suction feeding, plus a faster gape angle opening velocity. First, maximum gape and gape angle occurred, followed by maximum gular depression. This was followed by initial jaw closure. These results were consistent between suction and pierce feeding. This sequence was also consistent across all species except the harbor seal, where maximum gular depression occurred before both maximum gape and gape angle and initial jaw closure. During suction feeding, maximum gape was significantly smaller in bearded, ringed, and spotted seals. Feeding event time was significantly shorter in harbor and ringed seals. Significantly fewer jaw motions were observed in harbor and ringed seals. In harbor seals, closing velocity was faster, while time to maximum gular depression was longer. In ringed seals, time to initial jaw closure was shorter. Maximum gape angle and maximum gular depression were smaller, and maximum gape angle opening velocity was slower. For suction feeding, bearded seals had the highest variability within the kinematic variables of all species. Ringed seals had the lowest variability. For pierce feeding, spotted seals had the highest kinematic variability, while harbor seals had the lowest.
Sadly, we only have a short period of time to discuss the results collected from these majestic pinnipeds. This comparative behavioral study elucidates the importance of suction feeding in the aquatic environment in animals with relatively similar cranial morphologies. Some pinnipeds are not quite content with suction feeding to fulfill their voracious appetites. As such, they have decided to adopt another strategy, pierce feeding. This peculiar behavior results in a diverse cranial and mandibular structure. All of these pinnipeds, competing for food sources over the millennia, have resulted in both different prey capture and manipulation strategies. Some of the most uncivilized pinnipeds have taken to external food processing, similar to how we blend food for the elderly human. This also results in longer feeding event times. One of the most feared feeding techniques, grip and tear feeding, was not observed in this experiment. Since this technique is often utilized to eat larger prey, which were not captured and fed to these pinnipeds during this study. Suction feeding was associated with reduced tooth complexity, loss of teeth, and broad and flat rostrums, along with wide arched palates. A robust orofacial musculature was also observed to enhance pressure differences. Bearded seals, the most ancestral lineage of the pinniped line that diverged long ago, had the most strongly correlated skull morphology to its feeding strategy, suction. Even though the ancestral feeding technique was biting, bearded seals generate the suction pressures akin to specialized suction feeders such as the walrus. This species also has diverse kinematics, which may aid in specific feeding processes associated with suction feeding. Harbor, ringed, and spotted seals, classic pierce feeders, generated suction for feeding even though their skull morphologies were not specialized for this process. Their morphologies were characterized by large postcanines and large pterygoid bones and long tooth rows. Since these species do not have the specialized suction feeding morphologies, they may be unable to create larger pressure differences while suction feeding. Even though all the species examined in the study had similar kinematic profiles corresponding to a certain feeding context or technique. The distinct feeding strategies displayed in this study each had unique kinematic parameters.
Bearded, harbor, ringed, and spotted seals all vary their feeding behavior within the same feeding context. All species used pierce and suction feeding. However, bearded seals also resort to biting when underwater if the food is large enough to warrant it. So, why would a seal be interested in utilizing different feeding strategies? Well, for starters, the more flexible an organism is and the more food sources that can actually be obtained by the organism, the better suited they are for their environment. Abiotic and biotic changes, seasonal changes, life history, and even body size can all affect feeding behavior in seals. The different prey the seal eats also can change their feeding behaviors. Large schools of fish, for example, were associated with stalking and sudden darting movements in the seals in an attempt to catch their next meal. Seal suction feeding is different in slight ways from other aquatic mammals, but similar to other pinniped organisms, like walruses. Seals have slower gape angle opening and closing velocities. They were also found to have smaller gular depressions. The research showed here the suction feeding in pinnipeds is not as conserved as it is in fish. Overall, this study gives some insight into how pinnipeds, and specifically seals, have been able to survive and flourish as apex predators in a wide range of ecosystems worldwide. It also reinforced that evolution drives morphological changes, allowing organisms like seals to expand their diets.